Global narrative. The global narrative is the nonstop, cradle-to-grave, thought-womb propaganda, digital, analog, and paper, we are immersed in daily. It's always been here. Maybe you know it by another name: consensus reality, tribal consciousness, propaganda, culture. It's all the same thing, really, only it's deeper than most people think. It's not just the aggregation of ignorance, the psychology of the mob, or any of those other sociological excuses for an explanation. It was a multidimensional campaign to suppress human potential. The crux of the enemy's campaign is the isolation of the free-thinking individual, the realized man or woman. Shut them down by isolating, ridiculing, shaming, naming, blaming, and if none of that works, banishment. The global narrative is the non-stop story of humanity told by miscreants, deceivers, enforcers, both literal and mental, and controllers. We are social beings. We have families, communities, nations, religions, and a host of other binding agents. We go from one to many, and when we do, our thinking changes. We conform, do we not? Think of high school. Remember how important every detail of our appearance was. Remember how easy it was for predatory companies to market against that fear of being outside, to sell us denim pants, but not just any denim. They had to be the exact style that was in fashion, and so it went for everything: hair, teeth, shoes, and friends. All of our worth was in the group. There are sub-narratives for race, gender, earning income, and just about anything else we can think of. The need to belong never goes away. There is a deeper meaning to global narrative, to social consciousness, a far more sinister meaning. The global narrative is the boundary of what we can accept as reality. This is maintained by religious leaders, science, government, medicine, academe, and just about anything else that is institutional. This is the true control narrative. When someone comes along and speaks outside this global narrative, they get censored at first. If that doesn't work, they lose their job. If what they're saying is self-supporting, meaning it can provide the income lost upon job termination, then maybe death or incarceration. Galileo is a classic example. He presented his astronomy to the world. It contradicted the Vatican, even at a time when Copernicus was openly discussed. And contrary to contemporary belief, the Catholic Church had commenced a vigorous support campaign for science some years earlier, but something about Galileo conflicted much more severely with the Church. Perhaps it was just the time, the age. The Church had reached its peak of corruption at the time of Galileo. The point here is that the global narrative, the control narrative, is maintained by the dominant institutions of the day. These institutions did not evolve naturally. Unknown directors and producers are crafting the actors in the institutions. This is not to say there are not people in the institutions who are true believers. There are, however, at the top, there is commiseration with the unknown directors and producers. It was true at the time of Galileo, it's true today, and it's always been true. In the ancient past, it was more of an overt war, as we were multidimensional ourselves back then. The global narrative is scripted. It's planned generations in advance. It's been planned in ages unrecognizable to man. It's been planned. This is the hack in the hologram, the sub-frequencies of distortion, dislocation, and isolation from ourselves, from each other, and the Creator. The contemporary global narrative began 300 years ago, at the dawn of industrialization, when electricity and engines were incorporated by a society not grounded in electricity. Science had to adapt concepts to fit the circumstance, and religion and spirituality had to adapt to the new reality. Electromagnetism had been known about for some time within hermetic orders of alchemists, essentially secret societies of their time. It was the beginning of a society that would build around internal combustion engines started by electricity. This moved to power plants, electrical grid work across the planet, and the reorganization of the various belief systems around this. It was a rapid change after centuries of relative consistency, and it's been this way ever since. Rapid change. We went from outdoor bathrooms to nuclear explosions in a generation, and from there to the complete re-engineering of society and the roles therein, including gender, in another 2 generations, all the while being dragged by the ankles into the cave of digitization. The silicon mistress who hates sunlight because its light pales and because it's vain. And just like that, the global narrative became an illegal police chokehold. Who's minding the store? This is destruction engineering, self-destruction, nihilism, meaninglessness, vacuity, and remorse for even existing. It's all engineered. Those Nazi paperclip acquisitions knew a thing or two about the public mind and various leverages thereupon. We went from semi-literacy in the multidimensional reality to a closed, rational, subject and object reality, with no remembrance of how the two melded together and life had natural magic. They hammered us hard with the century of philosophy. Those hammer-headed Germans and French bleeding heart sophists, always pretending to be liberated from their Christ, but still erecting crosses everywhere they went. It all just sort of reduced and degraded us, but at the time it was all the rage. They called it the Enlightenment. A yogi might see the irony, not many others. It was the age of reason, of evidence, of progress, of intolerance for dogma, and a time of renegotiated social contracts. That's the key thing right there, the contracts. It's always about the contracts. People don't understand what a contract is, what a bond is, or what a promise is anymore. The new norm was if you cannot prove it, then it's not real. In some ways, this was good. It cleaned out a lot of stale spirituality and superstition. But it was a classic baby with the bathwater situation. Pre-modern societies, which included the recently discovered New World of America and its native population, were slated for conquest, usurpation by war, and the native population was slated for destruction. The actors in Europe, the Pope, the monarchies, and some of the secret societies knew the native population was in America. They were a bad example of autonomy and freedom that had to be destroyed. The long-term plan had already been formed. They needed to get people into cities as slave labor for industrial production lines. The slaves created and empowered the collective belief system. People lived in their bubbles of reality before this urban amalgamation. They had space. Communities lived a few hundred kilometers apart. They had their unique narratives maintained by the chief, sheriff, or community council. Secret societies proliferated so people could have their narrative among followers and believers. The writers of the global narrative understood they needed to inspire awe, and they knew they could do it with trains, automobiles, electricity, indoor plumbing, hot and cold water, refrigeration, and telephones. By the 1920s, people were living in wooden, stone, or brick houses that needed heating. In a century and a quarter, electricity was in homes. People no longer needed whale fat for candles and oil. Understand how monumental this was. 90% of the world was lit by whale fat for millennia. The narrative had to be updated, revised, and maintained from one generation to the next to suppress anything that was not fitting into the official story.